The administrative and legal machinery of the Roman Empire was built upon a careful balance between public authority and private hierarchy, a system in which status defined not only privilege but also vulnerability. Within this framework, accusations of conspiracy carried a particular weight, especially when they involved members of the elite. For noblewomen, whose lives were closely tied to family lineage, property transmission, and political alliances, the charge of conspiracy did not exist in isolation. It intersected with broader concerns about loyalty, inheritance, and the stability of imperial rule. Historical records indicate that Roman law did not treat women as entirely independent legal actors in the same manner as men, yet elite women occupied a paradoxical position. They could own property, manage estates, and influence political networks through kinship ties. Contemporary accounts describe how these connections made them both valuable allies and potential liabilities. When conspiracies were uncovered or suspected, noblewomen were often drawn into investigations not necessarily because they acted directly, but because their familial associations placed them within circles of suspicion. Surviving legal texts suggest that charges of conspiracy, particularly under the broad category of maiestas, or treason against the state, expanded significantly during the imperial period. Initially defined in relation to acts against the Roman people, the concept gradually evolved to include offenses against the emperor's dignity and authority. This expansion created a legal environment in which indirect actions, private speech, or even perceived disloyalty could be interpreted as treasonous. For noblewomen, whose communications and domestic spaces were deeply embedded in elite political culture, this ambiguity proved consequential. Chroniclers noted that investigations into conspiracy often began with informants, a feature institutionalized through systems of denunciation. These informants, sometimes motivated by personal grievances or the promise of reward, provided testimony that could implicate entire households. The legal codes of the period reveal that testimony extracted under coercion, including from enslaved individuals within a noblewoman's household, was considered admissible in cases of treason. This practice effectively dissolved the boundary between private and public spheres, exposing domestic life to state scrutiny. The procedures that followed an accusation were shaped by both legal norms and imperial discretion. Unlike Republican courts, where formal trials involved juries, imperial cases, especially those concerning treason, were frequently handled within the Senate or under the direct authority of the emperor. Surviving documents suggest that noblewomen could be summoned for questioning, their property temporarily seized, and their social networks examined. The process was less about establishing guilt through consistent standards of evidence, and more about assessing potential threats to political stability. Punishments for noblewomen accused of conspiracy varied, but patterns emerge across different reigns. Exile was among the most common outcomes. Contemporary accounts describe how women of high status were sent to remote islands or distant provinces, effectively removing them from the political center. This form of punishment served multiple functions. It neutralized perceived threats without the immediate spectacle of execution, preserved a degree of social decorum, and allowed the state to confiscate portions of the individual's property. Exile, however, was not a benign outcome. Surviving correspondence and later historical analyses indicate that conditions in these places of banishment were often harsh. Noblewomen accustomed to urban estates and complex household structures found themselves isolated, with limited resources and reduced social standing. The logistical realities of exile, restricted movement, dependence on imperial permission for basic needs, and the loss of familial support, transformed what might appear as a moderate sentence into a prolonged form of social and economic erasure. In more severe cases, execution was imposed, though the methods reflected Roman sensitivities regarding status. Legal codes of the period reveal a distinction between forms of execution considered appropriate for elites and those reserved for lower classes. Noblewomen were often compelled to take their own lives, a practice framed as preserving dignity while still fulfilling the sentence. This expectation aligned with broader Roman cultural values surrounding honor and control over one's fate, even within the constraints of state punishment. The role of family in these proceedings cannot be overlooked. Historical records indicate that the fate of a noblewoman accused of conspiracy frequently extended beyond the individual. Property confiscation affected heirs, alliances were disrupted, and entire family lines could experience diminished influence. In some instances, relatives attempted to distance themselves from the accused, providing testimony or emphasizing their own loyalty to the emperor. In others, family members faced parallel investigations, creating a cascading effect of suspicion. The imperial household itself was not immune to these dynamics. Contemporary accounts describe cases in which women connected to the emperor, through marriage or extended kinship, were implicated in conspiracies. These situations presented particular challenges, as they blurred the boundary between personal relationships and political authority. The responses varied depending on the reigning emperor's priorities, ranging from discreet exile to highly publicized punishment intended to reinforce the legitimacy of imperial rule. Surviving documents suggest that the treatment of noblewomen accused of conspiracy also reflected broader shifts in governance. Under certain emperors, there was a tendency toward increased surveillance and reliance on informants, which corresponded with a higher frequency of treason trials. In these periods, the threshold for suspicion appeared lower and the consequences more severe. Conversely, other reigns exhibited a more restrained approach, with fewer recorded cases and a greater emphasis on reconciliation or quiet removal from political life. The lived experience of these women, as reconstructed from available evidence, was shaped by uncertainty. The lack of consistent procedural safeguards meant that outcomes could depend heavily on factors such as imperial favor, the strength of one's social network, and the broader political climate. Chroniclers noted that even rumors could initiate investigations, creating an environment in which maintaining loyalty was as much about perception as it was about action. Within this context, noblewomen navigated a complex set of expectations. They were expected to embody ideals of virtue, loyalty, and familial duty, while also participating, often indirectly, in the political strategies of their households. This dual role placed them in a position where their influence was both significant and precarious. The mechanisms of control employed by the Roman state, including surveillance, legal ambiguity, and punitive exile, functioned not only to address specific cases of conspiracy, but also to reinforce broader norms of behavior among the elite. Archaeological findings and inscriptions provide additional insight into the aftermath of such accusations. In some cases, the erasure of names from public monuments suggests an attempt to remove the memory of individuals deemed disloyal. This practice, often associated with broader policies of condemnation, extended the consequences of accusation beyond physical punishment into the realm of historical record. For noblewomen, whose legacy was closely tied to family honor, such measures represented a profound form of posthumous penalty. Over time, the patterns observed in these cases contributed to an evolving understanding of power within the Roman Empire. The treatment of noblewomen accused of conspiracy illustrates how legal structures, social hierarchies, and political imperatives intersected to produce outcomes that were as much about maintaining authority as they were about administering justice. The surviving evidence, though fragmentary, consistently points to a system in which the boundaries between guilt, suspicion, and political necessity were often indistinct. These dynamics would continue to shape the experiences of elite women across successive generations, as the empire adapted to internal pressures and shifting models of governance. The records that remain do not offer a complete picture, but they provide a framework through which the realities of accusation, punishment, and survival can be understood within the broader context of Roman imperial rule. The consequences of accusation did not end with sentencing, and in many cases, the formal judgment marked only the beginning of a prolonged process of social and political dissolution. Surviving documents suggest that once a noblewoman had been formally associated with conspiracy, whether through conviction or sustained suspicion, her identity within Roman society was fundamentally altered. The mechanisms that followed operated less visibly than trials or exile, yet they proved equally significant in determining the long-term outcome of her life and the fortunes of her family. Property confiscation was among the most immediate and tangible consequences. Legal records indicate that in cases of treason, the state often seized substantial portions of an accused individual's wealth. For noblewomen, whose estates could include urban residences, rural lands, and complex networks of dependents, this represented not only economic loss, but also the dismantling of their administrative authority. Estate management, which had provided a degree of autonomy and influence, was transferred to imperial control or redistributed among loyalists. Contemporary accounts describe how such seizures were sometimes partial, allowing a minimal allowance for survival, but the overall effect was the erosion of independence. The redistribution of confiscated property also reveals the political utility of these punishments. Surviving correspondence and administrative records suggest that emperors frequently allocated seized assets to supporters, reinforcing loyalty within elite circles. In this way, the punishment of one individual contributed to the consolidation of power elsewhere. The removal of a noblewoman from her estate did not occur in isolation. It was part of a broader reorganization of influence that extended across regions and social networks. Equally significant was the impact on legal identity and status. Roman law, as reflected in surviving codes and commentaries, placed considerable emphasis on reputation. Once a noblewoman was associated with disloyalty, even if her punishment was limited to exile, her standing within the social hierarchy diminished sharply. This loss of status affected not only her personal interactions, but also her capacity to engage in legal and economic activities. Contracts, inheritances, and marriage arrangements became more difficult to negotiate, as other families sought to avoid association with perceived instability. Marriage alliances, in particular, were deeply affected. Historical records indicate that the marriages of elite families functioned as instruments of political strategy, designed to strengthen ties and secure mutual interests. When a noblewoman was accused of conspiracy, these alliances could unravel. Existing marriages might be dissolved under pressure, while prospective unions were abandoned. The disruption of these networks had long-term consequences, altering the balance of power among aristocratic families and limiting opportunities for future generations. The role of children in these situations adds another layer of complexity. Surviving documents suggest that the offspring of accused noblewomen were not automatically subjected to punishment, but their prospects were nonetheless shaped by the circumstances. In some cases, children were permitted to retain portions of family property or to continue their social advancement, particularly if they demonstrated loyalty to the emperor. In others, they faced restrictions that limited their participation in public life. The variability of these outcomes reflects the discretionary nature of imperial authority, which could prioritize stability over uniform application of legal principles. The conditions of exile itself varied depending on location and imperial policy. Contemporary accounts describe a range of environments, from relatively accessible coastal regions to isolated islands with limited infrastructure. While some exiles were permitted to maintain a small household, including a reduced number of attendants, others experienced more restrictive conditions. Surviving correspondence from exiled individuals indicates that communication with the outside world was often controlled, requiring official permission for letters or visits. This regulation of contact served to contain not only physical movement, but also the flow of information. Daily life in exile required adaptation to new realities. Noblewomen who had previously overseen large estates and participated in complex social rituals found themselves engaged in more constrained routines. Archaeological evidence from known sites of exile suggests modest living arrangements, with limited access to the amenities associated with elite urban life. The psychological impact of such conditions, while difficult to quantify, is implied in surviving writings that emphasize themes of isolation, uncertainty, and the loss of social identity. In certain instances, exile was not intended to be permanent. Legal records indicate that under changing political circumstances, individuals could be recalled, their property partially restored, and their status rehabilitated. These reversals were often tied to shifts in imperial leadership or policy, highlighting the fluid nature of justice within the Roman system. However, restoration was rarely complete. The period of absence and the association with prior accusations left enduring marks on reputation and influence. More severe cases, particularly those resulting in execution, produced a different set of consequences. As noted in historical sources, noblewomen condemned to death were often granted the opportunity to carry out the sentence privately. This practice, while framed as a concession to status, also functioned as a means of controlling public perception. By avoiding the spectacle of execution, the state minimized the potential for unrest or sympathy among the populace. At the same time, the expectation of self-inflicted death reinforced the authority of the imperial system, demonstrating that even the highest ranks were subject to its demands. The aftermath of such executions extended into the realm of memory and record. Surviving inscriptions and literary sources indicate that the names of condemned individuals could be removed from public monuments, a practice associated with the broader concept of erasing dishonor. This process affected not only the individual but also their family, as shared monuments and genealogies were altered to reflect the new reality. The deliberate manipulation of public memory served to reinforce the narrative of loyalty and disloyalty that underpinned imperial governance. The involvement of informants and accusers did not necessarily end with the conclusion of a case. Contemporary accounts describe how individuals who provided testimony could receive rewards, including financial compensation or advancement within the administrative hierarchy. This system created incentives for continued vigilance, but it also introduced elements of instability. Surviving legal discussions suggest that accusations could be motivated by personal rivalries, leading to cycles of denunciation that extended beyond initial investigations. The broader political climate played a decisive role in shaping these processes. Under emperors who emphasized security and centralized control, the frequency of conspiracy accusations appears to have increased. Chroniclers noted periods in which the boundaries of acceptable behavior were narrowly defined and deviations, whether real or perceived, were met with swift response. In such environments, noblewomen, by virtue of their connections and visibility, remained particularly exposed. Conversely, other periods exhibited a more measured approach, with fewer recorded cases and a greater emphasis on stability through restraint. Surviving administrative records from these times suggest that while the legal framework for addressing conspiracy remained in place, its application was less expansive. Noblewomen accused during these periods might experience investigation and temporary restriction, but without the same degree of severity in punishment. The intersection of gender and power is evident throughout these patterns. While Roman society imposed certain limitations on women's formal participation in politics, their influence within elite networks ensured that they remained integral to the functioning of the system. Historical records indicate that their involvement in conspiracies, whether direct or indirect, was often interpreted through the lens of these roles. This interpretation could both mitigate and exacerbate consequences, depending on the context. In examining these cases, it becomes apparent that the experience of noblewomen accused of conspiracy cannot be reduced to a single trajectory. The outcomes were shaped by a combination of legal precedent, political necessity, and individual circumstance. Surviving evidence consistently points to a system in which flexibility and discretion were central, allowing the imperial administration to respond to perceived threats in ways that aligned with broader objectives. The long-term effects of these processes extended beyond individual cases, influencing the behavior of the elite as a whole. The knowledge that accusation could lead to exile, confiscation, or death contributed to a culture of caution. Contemporary writings suggest that expressions of loyalty became more pronounced, and that the management of personal relationships took on increased importance. Noblewomen, in particular, navigated these dynamics with an awareness of both their potential influence and their vulnerability within the structures of imperial power. Over time, the cumulative effect of these practices contributed to a broader transformation in how power was exercised and perceived within the Roman Empire. The treatment of noblewomen accused of conspiracy was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a wider pattern in which the imperial system sought to regulate behavior through a combination of legal authority, social pressure, and the strategic use of punishment. Surviving documents suggest that this approach had lasting implications for both governance and the internal dynamics of elite society. One of the most significant long-term consequences was the normalization of surveillance within aristocratic life. Historical records indicate that by the height of the imperial period, awareness of potential denunciation had become deeply embedded in daily interactions. Correspondence from elite households reveals a cautious tone, with careful attention to language and the avoidance of statements that might be interpreted as disloyal. For noblewomen, whose roles often involved managing communication within extended family networks, this environment required a heightened sensitivity to the risks associated with even routine exchanges. The presence of informants, both formal and informal, altered the structure of trust within these networks. Contemporary accounts describe how enslaved individuals, freed persons, and even relatives could act as sources of information for authorities. The legal acceptance of testimony obtained under coercion further complicated these relationships, as it introduced the possibility that private conversations might later be recounted in a judicial context. This erosion of confidentiality extended into domestic spaces, effectively integrating the household into the mechanisms of state oversight. The imperial administration's reliance on such systems also influenced the behavior of emperors themselves. Surviving historical narratives suggest that some rulers actively encouraged denunciations as a means of identifying potential threats, while others sought to limit their use in order to maintain stability. The variability of these approaches underscores the degree to which the experience of accusation depended on the priorities of individual emperors. For noblewomen, this meant that their vulnerability could fluctuate significantly over time, even without changes in their own circumstances. Legal ambiguity remained a defining feature of these cases. The expansion of treason laws, as reflected in surviving legal texts, created a framework in which intent was often inferred rather than clearly demonstrated. Actions that might previously have been considered private or inconsequential could be reinterpreted as evidence of disloyalty. This ambiguity allowed authorities to respond flexibly to perceived threats, but it also introduced uncertainty into the lives of those subject to these laws. Noblewomen, whose activities were closely tied to familial and social obligations, operated within this uncertain space. The cultural expectations placed upon elite women further shaped the interpretation of their actions. Roman moral discourse emphasized ideals of modesty, loyalty, and adherence to traditional roles. When noblewomen were accused of conspiracy, these expectations influenced both the accusations themselves and the responses of authorities. Chroniclers noted that deviations from expected behavior could be cited as supporting evidence, even in the absence of direct involvement in political plots. This dynamic illustrates how social norms and legal processes intersected to produce outcomes that reinforced existing hierarchies. The impact of these accusations on collective memory also warrants attention. Inscriptions, monuments, and literary works served as primary vehicles for preserving the reputations of elite individuals. When a noblewoman was condemned, the alteration or removal of these records effectively reshaped how she would be remembered. Surviving examples of such modifications indicate that the process was not merely symbolic, but had tangible effects on the historical narrative. Families associated with the condemned often undertook efforts to distance themselves, adjusting genealogies and public representations to align with the prevailing political climate. At the same time, some accounts preserved traces of alternative perspectives. Later historians occasionally revisited cases of alleged conspiracy, offering interpretations that differed from official records. These retrospective analyses suggest that not all accusations were universally accepted, even within the context of imperial authority. However, the extent to which such reinterpretations influenced contemporary understanding was limited, as the immediate consequences of accusation had already taken effect. The administrative dimension of these processes also evolved. As the empire expanded and its bureaucracy became more complex, the handling of conspiracy cases required coordination across different levels of governance. Surviving administrative documents indicate that provincial authorities could be involved in enforcing sentences, particularly in cases of exile. This integration of local and central authority ensured that punishments were implemented consistently, while also extending the reach of imperial control into distant regions. Economic considerations played a role as well. The confiscation and redistribution of property, as noted in earlier records, contributed to the fiscal resources of the state and the patronage networks of the emperor. Over time, this practice became an established component of the response to treason. For noblewomen, whose wealth was often tied to land and estates, the economic dimension of punishment was inseparable from its social and political aspects. The loss of property not only diminished their immediate circumstances, but also affected the long-term viability of their family's position within the elite. The intersection of these factors created an environment in which adaptation was necessary for survival. Surviving correspondence and literary sources suggest that noblewomen employed various strategies to navigate the risks associated with their position.